This week we celebrate Palm Sunday, the day we remember the story of Jesus entering Jerusalem riding on a colt and an ass. We read of him being welcomed as a conquering hero. It's a story that actually is in all four of our Gospels, which makes it a really important one according to the Gospel writers, because so many of the other stories don't appear in all four. In Matthew's version, Matthew has particular aspects, but one of them is that he gives a reference to the prophecy of Zechariah about the one who comes riding on a donkey who will non-violently bring about peace. And maybe that's something you could look up in Zechariah. You may not have read it before. There's a theologian by the name of Crossan who writes that Matthew writes about this really strange aspect of this story in which the disciples are told to go and get a colt and a donkey. And it's always been, I've heard all sorts of explanations for it, but Crossan, to me, writes the best explanation. There's all sorts of weird explanations that it's actually a mistake in the text, that he can't actually have ridden two animals. Bit of comedy, a bit of light comedy. But Crossan actually writes that two animals, a donkey and her little colt beside her, and that Jesus rides them in the sense of having them both as a part of his highly symbolic sort of ride. In other words, Jesus doesn't ride a stallion or a mare or a mule or a male donkey, not even just a female donkey. He rides the most unmilitary mount imaginable, a female nursing donkey with her little colt riding alongside her. I love that reading of it. You know, it feels like a weird story to be retelling at this time. After all, if Jesus was to ride into our town at the moment on a colt or a donkey or whatever, he'd be greeted with rather empty streets. And there would be no crowds or gatherings of people to throw down their coats or branches in front of him. If they were, people would be faced with rather hefty fines for daring to gather in the streets in groups of more than two. Although perhaps we might be tempted to risk the fines if we really believed that Jesus was going to save us from the coronavirus. Remember that Hosanna really means save now, save us. It's not a cry of praise. I was brought up with this idea that Hosanna was a cry of praise. It's actually an appeal for help. That's what the people of Jesus' time were responding to on his entry into Jerusalem. They were looking to Jesus to save them, to take apart the oppressive Roman Empire that they were in the grip of, and to bring them into a new time and place of freedom, justice and hope. And both for people then and us now, that alternative of another time and situation is only appealing if the situation that they have at present is in some way a place they don't want to be. Reading the newspapers of that day, you would likely have given us stories of insurgents fighting Roman occupation, of sick people such as lepers forced to live outside society on reservations, or landowners evicting tenants who then became the homeless poor. You could find parallels today, I suppose. Although our newspapers are dominated by coronavirus, it hasn't taken away the issues of environmental degradation and crisis, and it certainly hasn't taken away the isolation. It's only intensified the isolation and danger that asylum seekers live in across the world. And this village prophet Jesus rode into the midst of all of that, and the people responded with an enthusiasm that came out of their desperation and their fear, but also their longing for something different. Jesus' act of coming in to Jerusalem in that way was a prophetic act, an act of hope, an act of compassion, of healing, and of a promise of genuine liberty and justice for all. Jesus riding on an ass or a colt and the mother donkey and the baby is a symbol and a sign of the vulnerable good and the true power of that vulnerable good. I've preached about this story a fair bit because I've been in ministry a little while now. And so often when I've preached on this story, I've been pretty critical and negative about the crowd that greeted Jesus. What were they thinking? How dare they expect a conquering hero? How could they not know the real Jesus? How could they be so needy? And how dare they welcome him and then a couple of days later call for his crucifixion? But this year, I feel like I'm invited into a different view of the crowd, because the crowd in the end were just people like me. In the end, we are the crowd. And yes, we know the desperation for freedom, for peace, for justice and for healing. We are the people who long for what Jesus offers and sometimes misunderstand. But at heart, I don't think the crowd were evil. They really did see the vulnerable good in Jesus and a chance for real peace. And we still in this day long for that vulnerable goodness of God. In this time of what I'll call involuntary withdrawal, we long for the goodness of God. This longing for release, for freedom, is what the crowds around Jesus were feeling. And it's a good longing. Our longing for freedom and for peace today echoes their longing, and it's a yearning that comes, I think, from the divine. We long for signs of God's peace and love. And if our eyes are open, the Prince of Peace still rides our streets and we still can follow. May we this week particularly embrace our yearning as a yearning for peace and for justice and for freedom, and know that God is our companion and our source of hope in that yearning. I finish with a little reading. It's a poem by Auden. Defenceless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame.